we're seeing almost day by day a tremendous and horrific escalation of the Israel-Palestine conflict. More rockets fired from the Hamas side at Israeli civilians. Israel stepping up its response. I see that Netanyahu has basically said, I'm going to make these people pay a heavy price. And Israel also talking about the fact that this could be a protracted, a long-lasting conflict. Very traumatizing for them, and very sad for us to watch across the ocean. Why? Because we and I identify with these people, identify with what they're going through. This little country sitting in the middle of, surrounded by enemies. Enemies, by the way, not just in the Muslim world, but enemies all over the world. Almost isolated, having typically to rely on only a single ally, the United States, and now even that is somewhat in question. All of this is hard to watch. And there is a key moral distinction. The Hamas people are attacking Israeli civilians deliberately. And they're also, in a sense, setting up their camps in areas that have civilian populations. Why? Because then when Israel fires back, they can say, oh, you killed civilians. Even though the killing of civilians on both sides is being driven, you may say, by Hamas. Now, from America's point of view, and some Americans will look at all this, and I see this is true of the secular media, it's also true of the secular Jews in America, a lot of them don't seem to really care about Israel. At least that is the significance one can attach to their actions, to their political indifference to what is happening. But that is not the case in Israel. In Israel, there is a powerful sense, and this is shared by religious Jews, but it's also shared by secular Jews, that there is a sort of providential, one may almost say miraculous significance to Israel. And that's what I want to talk about. I want to begin by talking about this conflict at the wide-angle view. In the next segment, I'm going to zoom in and talk specifically at the kind of narrow, the more close-up view, you might say. But here I want to talk about the millennial, the messianic, the biblical significance of Israel. I was talking to a Jewish commentator some years ago now from Israel, and he was talking about Zionism. And he made the point, he said, I'm a secular Jew. He says, Jews traditionally are the people who rejected Jesus as the Messiah. Why? Because they believed that some other later Messiah was going to be the true Messiah. And he said, and the religious Jews are still hopeful. They're still waiting for this Messiah, this true Messiah, to show up. He said, well, we're not. We secular Jews don't think there's going to be another kind of genuine, the real article Messiah. He says, but we attach that same religious significance to the state of Israel. In other words, our Zionism, our belief in the idea of the Jews coming back together to their ancestral land, we invest that with a certain kind of sacred significance. So Zionism, he was saying, remarkably, is the fulfillment of a kind of messianic hope. The return of the Jewish people to Israel is perhaps the most significant prophecy in the Bible, pointing to the beginning of the end times. I emphasize the beginning of the end times because the end times could be a day, a year, perhaps even a century. I'm not trying to sort of put a date on it. I'm not trying to say we are in the last year or the last even decades of the end of the world. But I am saying that the last age, when the Bible talks about, uses words like age, and notice that in the first book of Genesis, it talks also about the days of creation, which some people have interpreted as ages, in the first age and the second age, and so on. So are we in the final epoch? Well, Christians believe, and I think rightly, based upon biblical prophecy, that Israel's side is God's side. So that to take sides against Israel is by and large to take sides with the enemy of God. And this is the way in which the Old Testament, you may say, is incorporated into the New. Even though Christ brings forward a new dispensation, Christ is, you may say, a new Moses, the early apostles decide that you don't have to follow the Jewish laws if you are a Christian. But nevertheless, there is this deep spiritual link with the Jews. And I think that Christians in America believe, and I believe, that Israel is a providential nation. Just as, by the way, I believe that America is a providential nation. So you have a kind of spiritual linking of two providential nations. And what do we mean by providential nations? It's important to understand we don't actually mean that God only cares about Israel or God only cares about America. In fact, it's very clear in the Old Testament that when God chose the Jews, they are the chosen people. But chosen for what? Are they chosen for their moral excellence? Are they chosen for their deep devotion to God? No. They're chosen, you may say, by just divine decree. Many times the Jews in the Old Testament are not faithful to God. They turn away from him, and this stimulates, God's jealousy, God's wrath. Why? Because these people that he chose just because he chose them. And the chosenness here implies not only a certain kind of privilege, but also a certain kind of responsibility. The Jews, as God's chosen people, have special duties, special allegiances to God that's not expected of the so-called Gentiles at the time. Now, very interestingly, when I speak what seems to be sort of religious language, and some secular people are, what is Dinesh even talking about? Isn't this supposed to be a secular podcast? But the truth of the matter is the Muslims understand this language. When you talk about a providential nation, when you talk about God's will in the world, the Muslims understand this. When they use terms like infidel, they're speaking about the enemies of God. They're using themselves a kind of theological language. I think of Biden's role in this crazy situation. I just saw there's a lot of left-wing angst over Biden's decision to actually provide, at this moment, additional military aid to Israel, $735 million in additional, not humanitarian, not food aid, not even economic aid, but military aid. And the left is like, oh my gosh, what's going on here? I almost feel like Biden here is a kind of Pontius Pilate. He's the guy caught in the middle of the situation. He would rather not have to deal with it. Here he has on one side these Pharisees, and oddly enough, the Pharisees here are people like Ilhan Omar, AOC. They're screaming for vengeance. Oh, turn against Israel, crucify Israel. And Biden's like, they haven't really done anything wrong. They're the ones who have been attacked in this situation. So Biden would love to wash his hands off the matter, but he is being pushed, he is being pressured by his own side and by his own party to yield, to give in, to switch America's traditional allegiance toward Israel. I'm not sure where all this is going to go. Israel clearly is the stronger party here, and I'm happy to see that they don't seem to lack the will. And how can they? I mean, this is an existential fight for them. If they only have to lose once, they have to win every single time just to stay in existence as a country. I don't know if Biden has the will to support Israel, but I'm certainly hoping, and I would add praying, that Israel has the will to defend itself.